and send everyone a copy so that you can pass it around or have it in case you want to watch it again. I will also post it on E3 Community, so it takes about an hour and a half for the webinar to load, so once it gets done, I'll send it over to you. But today's webinar is about hot carding. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
wonderful. Thank you, thank you.
Yes.
And I will send everyone a copy of this white paper, and it's about the hot carding. And this webinar is just for credit unions that use FIS or FSI. Okay, so we'll get started. So it's about hot carding. So what does hot carding mean? A hot card is basically a fraud block. So you can place a block on a card. And so what we're going to do is actually show you in iPower how to do that. So I've pulled up iPower, and I'm going to pull up an account. And I want to point out that my ATM and debit card screens are going to look different than your screens. Of course, this is a test environment, so it may have some additional features that are coming out next week. Okay, so we're going to actually go to an existing card. So as you know, you pull up a member's account and you select the ATM and Debit tab, and you will see all of the cards that that member has. So you'll have the PAN number, which is the card number. You'll also have the ownership, so it'll show the member's name. It'll show a P for primary or a J for joint, and it'll show the relationship to the primary. So as you can see, Daisy is the child, Sally's the daughter-in-law. It'll also show the embossed name, how the name appears on the card. The holder status, most of you probably won't have this column. That's if you use the same card numbers for primary and joint. And then you have the card status. This is an important field. It tells you the status of each card. So we know that a status 8 is a fraud status, or you can also call it a hot card. And a status 8 means the card has been lost or stolen. And we'll look at this in just a second. We also know that a status 7 is a closed card. A status 2 is if you wanted, it is an order, a card and PIN, so you've placed the order. A status 1 is an active card. So as you can see, this gives you at a glance what the card status is for each. Now, because I have a test environment, my activation date and last active are not populated, but that would tell you the date the card was activated and the last time the member used their card. And then, of course, your expiration date. So let's say that Teresa calls the credit union, excuse me, and says, I don't have my card in my wallet. I don't know what I did with it. I could have left it at home, but I'm not sure. Can you block my card temporarily so that I can call my husband or my kids or run home or whatnot? So you would say, absolutely. And you would pull up Teresa's account. You would look at her ATM and debit card screen, and you would find which card it is. So let's say it's this card, and you would select the edit pencil. And when you pull it up, you would select modify. And when you look at the status, this would probably be a 1. It would probably be active. You would set that to a 9, which right now says bad account. On Thursday, it will say temporary hold. And that's when the changes will go in. So if you did a status 9, that puts that card, it blocks the card temporarily. And what that means is that if anyone stole that card and tried to do transactions, they would be declined. However, if they put the card in an ATM, it would not capture the card because it's a temporary hold. So I can place that as a status 9 and select save. And when I cancel out, you can see on our screen that now our status is a 9. So we know that's a temporary hold. Now let's say that Teresa calls back an hour later and she says, oh, I found my card. Thank you so much. Can you unblock it for me? Well, in the past, you would have had to order Teresa a new card. So now the member would have had to wait 2 weeks before they received their new card. Well, now you can select the edit pencil, and you can change that status back to a 1. So we can make that card active again and select save. Now, let me point out one thing. With a temporary hold, and let me go back here. So now, as you can see, now the card is active, but whenever you do that, you would say, okay, Ms. Smith, I have released the block on your card, and your card is now active. However, you cannot use your card until tomorrow morning. It's a network regulation that if you remove a block on a card, you have to give it so much time. So they have to wait till the next day to use their card, which is still better than you having to order a card, but I want you to be aware that they cannot use the card until the next day. Okay? Now let's say that Teresa called back and said, I have called my husband, he doesn't have it, I've called my children, I've also looked in the laundry room in my blue jeans, and let's say it was at a temporary hold, and she says that, can you make it lost or stolen and order me a new card? Then if it was at a status 9, you could change it to a status 8. An 8 is lost or stolen, and this is a different type of block. This is a fraud block. And a fraud block means that it denies the transactions and it captures the card. So status 8 is a fraud block, and status 9 is a fraud-related block. So the only difference between the two is that a 9 is a temporary hold, so it doesn't capture the card, and an 8 captures the card. Now I'm going to tell you a little trick. Let's say Teresa called. Okay, so she just called back and said she can't find it, order her a new card. And then let's say 5 minutes later she calls back and says, oh, I found it. It was in my car in the floorboard. Is there any way that you can remove that block on my card? If it is the same business day, then you can change this back to a 1. But if Teresa calls back tomorrow and says that she found her card, it's too late. Now, I do know that some credit unions can go into FIS's data system and change it. I guess I'm not supposed to tell you that, but I know that you can modify it, but there is a time limit on it because you've got the chargebacks and all that kind of good stuff involved. But just to let you know, so I guess rule of thumb is you can change a status 8 back to active if it's the same day. You can change a status 9 back to active at any time. Okay, so I'm going to pull up this white paper just so I can kind of show you what we talked about. So we talked about the fraud block, which is a status 8, and a fraud-related block, which is a status 9. And it actually gives you screenshots. How do I place a block in iPower? So it shows you with the status 8. And then it also shows you a status 9, a temporary hold. And then if you keep going, it says, what would a temporary block be used for? So the examples I talked about with Teresa, those are here as well. In some credit unions, I want to point this out, if a member's account is negative, I've gotten some emails from a couple of credit unions asking for, I guess, a status where if a member's account's negative, you can block the card, but you don't want to have to pay the network fees to block it. A trick is, what you can do, is you can go into their account, select the edit pencil, and you can change all of these limits to 0. Now you can only do this if EPL is doing your limit authorizations. And if you don't know if EPL is doing it, then just let me know after this webinar or shoot me an email, and I'll find out if iPower does your limit authorizations or if the network does your authorizations. But if iPower does, you can select these to a 0, and you can actually select like a status 6 credit union defined. That blocks the card. So whenever they go to use the card, then they don't have a limit, so it would get declined. That way you don't have to set it to a fraud block where you get charged each day for it being on the list. Okay? Now also know in February, you'll have the ability to do temporary limits. So if a member calls and says, I want to buy a flat screen TV, and you need to adjust their limits, if iPower's set up to do your limit authorizations, you can actually put in temporary limits with a start and an end date. And of course, we'll be having a webinar about that. That'll go into more detail of how to do temporary limits and how that works. But actually, CSE was one of the ones that had requested this, so that will be added in February. And I'm going to back up and go back to our fraud blocks here. So again, we talked about if the member's account's negative and you want to block it. The status 8, it gives you the information. And I want to tell you about 2 other parameters we have. We have what's called an auto-reissue. So let me see. beginning with the release with MR370, if you go to your institution parameters screen, and I'm going to cancel out of this so you guys are getting a sneak peek. So I'm going to go to Manager Institution, Electronic Services, ATM or Debit, and Institution Parameters. On this screen, you will actually see a whole new section that is called Network Parameters, and you will have the ability to enable or disable these fields. Now, a couple of you have some hot carding fields. You also have the ability to enable this auto-reissue, and what that means is, and of course it'll have a yes or a no, and what that means is if you set a card to a status 8, lost or stolen, many times whenever they report their card lost or stolen, you have to set up a brand new card within iPower. Well, if you have this turned on, iPower will automatically set that card up for you, so you don't have to create a new card for them. So what the system does is each night when the branch closes, iPower will scan the database and it will say, I want a list of all of the cards that are set to a status 8, and it generates a list. That night, it takes all of those card records and it does a clone. So it basically clones the existing card record and it orders the card for you. Now, the only bad thing about this is if you have auto-reissue turned on, you can't change it back to a status 1 active the next day. Okay? So that's the only kickback, is if you have auto-reissue turned on, you cannot go back and turn it back to active the next day. Which between us, we know that really we need to change it back to 1 active that same day. But now that you know the trick, I just want you to be aware of what that means. And there's another one called Card Reactivate. Now, I have already enabled this for all of you. This allows you to change the card status, a temporary hold, or the lost or stolen hold, back to a 1 active. If your Card Reactivate is set to a 0, which means no, you wouldn't be able to do that. But I've already updated the database for you. Excuse me, with MR370, you'll actually see that field on the screen. So please do not change that field to a 0 unless you don't want to provide tellers the ability to change that back to an active card. And I'll go down with international transactions. Now, of course, everyone has a different fraud program, and I know that eFunds offers different packages. If you have any questions about your international transactions or your chargebacks, please contact eFunds or your league directly, and they can answer any questions that you may have. Those are set up with the network. Please do be aware that you have lots of options. There's different reports that you can pull that will show, and I will email you guys a sample of the reports within iPower that you can pull. You also have the ability at your network to block certain merchants, certain cities, certain countries, certain people's cards. So if you would like, I can get the network to send some more information about that, so I can send it to you, so that way you have a nice audit trail of your fraud program that you have. And if you have any questions about what's sent to the network, whenever you do a status 8, you will see AD as the reject reason code within the eFunds system. And if you did a status 9, you will now see an ND. And then I have the description and the settlement description for you as well. And that's everything. Does anybody have any questions about how to make a card hotter, or how to remove a block from a card? No? Hello?
Not now, thank you.
Okay, wonderful. It looks like I lost some people. Did anybody have to dial back in?